I look at a blank white screen, thinking about the email I need to write to help someone fix a problem they have. The problem doesn't matter. Someone else could do this, or we're understaffed at work and now it's my turn. The phone rings and I pick it up. It's that guy. I change my tone of voice to try and be pleasant to the person on the other side who actively belittles me. The conversation drags on, and I tell myself that it's for the best. Just put up with it. But the thought in the back of my head I've had this entire time grows louder as the person on the phone tells me how much of an idiot I am. What am I even doing? Hibike Euphonium, or Sound Euphonium, written by Ayano Takeda, was originally published as a novel in 2013, but I'll be talking about the 2 seasons of the show released in 2015 and 2016. The story follows Kumiko Omae and her life in the Kitaoji High School concert band. I want to make my opinions clear from the start. My feelings on this show are complicated, but they're not mixed. I love this show. I think it's absolutely incredible. That's the honest truth. But everyone reacts differently to different pieces of media. And for me, this is where my feelings get complicated. Because for all the praise and admiration I can give this show, it's also true that I find it to be almost completely unwatchable. It has nothing to do with anything that I think is bad. It's actually probably a testament to how good I think the show is at accomplishing what it's trying to do. So what I want to do is highlight something that this show excels at that I think a lot of people take for granted, especially for a story in this genre: world building. It might seem strange to bring up world building for a show like this, but every fictional story has to do it to some extent. World building is all about creating a fictional setting that feels tangible and lived in, and finding situations in that setting to move the story forward in a way that feels cohesive. For a lot of fantasy, that means creating something out of basically nothing, and there's a lot of consideration that needs to go into figuring out how to make the world work and feel tangible in that context. More grounded shows like Sound Euphonium don't seem like they would need to do as much work since there is a basis to start from. But that really isn't the case. Depending on how true to life you want the world to be, you need to find a lot of the intricacies specific to that setting and find ways of using those things to move the story forward. Sound Euphonium takes place in a high school concert band, but what's interesting is that it doesn't follow a band director building up a hopeless program or a star player working their way up to the top. In my head, those would be the obvious places to start for a story in this setting, and you could get something worthwhile out of those premises. In fact, there are characters in this story that fit those descriptions perfectly. Takeda herself even said that originally, Reina was supposed to be the lead, but the shift to Kumiko as the main character tells you everything you need to know about the story Takeda wanted to tell. Kumiko isn't an amazing musician. She's average at best, whose aspirations past high school are unclear. And she plays the euphonium, which isn't an uncommon instrument, but it isn't well known, and it certainly isn't flashy in most cases. This is not a story about exceptional people doing amazing things. It's about life in high school band, and that's about it. This is the foundation that the entire story is built on, and that foundation is planted firmly in reality. That means the goal of the world building for this story is to recreate the atmosphere of an actual high school band, which is pretty obvious. You probably didn't need me to tell you that. However, that world is very specific, and if you've never been in band, what seems realistic and what is realistic can vary. So you need to be careful with the conflicts you choose as to not break the logic of that world. I want you to consider how the story handles the auditions for the competition band. In the hands of someone else, I could imagine it broadly playing out like this. Taki announces the auditions for the band. Everyone practices their hearts out, discovering their love for music along the way. They all go through the audition, and on the day of the results, it's announced that everyone made it in. The audition was a trick to get everyone to practice. There are stories out there that do something like this, and for this story, it does make sense to some degree. If the goal was to get the band into a position where they could compete, this wouldn't be a completely unreasonable way of doing that, at least from a narrative perspective. I honestly thought that this was how the story would play out, but that's not what happens. And scenarios like this almost never happen in real life, especially in a band that wants to compete nationally. No matter how much Hazuki loves the tuba and no matter how much she practiced, as a beginner, it would be practically impossible for her to match people who have years of experience over her. That's just the reality of the situation. I know I'm pointing out something that the show doesn't do, but knowing what can and can't happen is important. Understanding how these scenarios would play out given the world you are trying to create is vital in making that setting feel real. But if you want to make that setting feel tangible, that requires a bit more work. In the audition, Taki asks Kumiko to play a section that wasn't announced before. For a brief moment, we see the anxiety and fear that comes along with being asked to do that. This detail is superfluous. If it was cut out entirely, nothing would change about the story. I know Natsuki points to this being the reason why she didn't make it, but not doing well in the audition in general works fine enough as a justification. However, this kind of thing happens all the time in auditions. Knowing that, and knowing how to use that detail to inject tension into the story is what makes this world feel lived in. It's these kinds of details that really showcase Takeda's understanding of this setting. And as it turns out, she actually was in band during high school. The story is filled with these tiny details, things that are hyper-specific to this setting, even if they have nothing to do with the overall narrative. Mizure saying that she's using her best reed for the concert. Some people have no idea that some reeds are better than others, or even that you have to keep it in your mouth, like she does, before you play to make sure it doesn't dry out. When Taki is introduced, students complain that they can't read his ictus. Most people have no idea what that even is. These details, along with the overall plot, add up to create something that feels genuine. Even some of the seemingly unrealistic scenarios are based on things that can't happen, or at the very least, are rooted in something specific. The situation between Mizore and Nozomi is played up, for sure, but the fact is that personal relationships can really affect how someone plays their instrument, just like how it does for Mizore in exactly the same way it affects her. Asuka's father is a famous euphonium player. That's kind of a stretch, but the conflict with her mom essentially boils down to a parent being worried when their child is so invested in something that ultimately leads nowhere in the future. That is something that happens all the time. The only real needless conflict I can think of is the tension between Reina and Kaori after the audition. In reality, things would have probably never played out like how it does in the show, because the auditions for the band and solo would have almost certainly been blind. Students would play their selections to the teachers behind their backs, just so that personal bias wouldn't be an issue. There would still be conflict, for sure, but not quite to the same level of the show. But the decision of not holding blind auditions is something that you could chalk up to Taki being inexperienced as a teacher. So in a way, it still kind of works. But I want to focus a bit more on the audition between Reina and Kaori, because to me it highlights the most impressive part about the show's world building, the sound design, and in particular, how people play their instruments. It's one thing for people to sound good in a show like this. Some of the playing here is amazing, but the really impressive part is how the show chooses to present people who sound bad. No one in the show sounds truly terrible, which is what you'd expect from a band like this since it's mostly filled with rather experienced members. But that's a difficult line to walk. For a show that's aimed at a general audience, the easiest thing to do so that most people could understand the things that were happening would be to make the contrast between good and bad playing as extreme as possible. In other words, it's easier to follow the journey the characters go through to sound like this if they first sounded like this. The show chooses not to go that far. In fact, the worst the band ever sounds is in the first episode. Don't get me wrong, it sounds pretty bad, but it's not terrible. To most people, it wouldn't sound great, but hey, it's a high school band, what do you expect? But that's exactly what I mean. The playing isn't just bad, it's bad in a believable way. In the audition, it would have been incredibly easy just to make Kaori sound awful, but She sounds fine. She sounds pretty good actually, as she would since she made it through the audition. But Reina just sounds better in a way that a more experienced player would be. As you can imagine, how people and instruments sound is an extremely important element to the world building in a show about concert band, so it's no surprise that a lot of thought and effort was put into that aspect. But I don't think I can stress just how impressive I think it is on that front. The show pays attention to these tiny things that most people wouldn't even think about. When there are scenes of Kumiko practicing, she makes mistakes that are common and then plays those passages again in a way that sounds like someone trying to fix those mistakes. It's something that's difficult to pick up on and notice if you don't know what you're looking for, and it's something that I didn't pick up on at first because I took it for granted. It's easy to forget that these are deliberate choices made by the people who worked on this show. Someone was directed to sound like Kumiko, practicing the euphonium. They needed to act that part out just through their playing. This attention to detail goes beyond individual playing. You can hear things when the band plays together too. The mistakes that Taki and the other teachers hear and comment on are things you can hear for yourself if you know what to listen for. These are steps that didn't need to be taken. If the show lied to people about what was going on with the music, I don't think anyone would have noticed, and I wouldn't have cared. These details don't play into the overall narrative in a meaningful way, but their inclusion makes the world feel much more cohesive and grounded in reality. Most of these choices would fall on sound director Yota Tsuruoka and the 2014 freshman wind ensemble of the Senzoku Gakuen College of Music, which played the wind ensemble music. Although, I'm not completely sure if Tsuruoka would have been the only one making these decisions, or if the wind ensemble also did the playing for individuals. It's a bit difficult to find anything about how the sound design was done for the show, but I at least wanted to mention them. It's these elements, the scenarios by Takeda, the sound design of the show, that when put together create a world that feels authentic. And there's one moment that I think brings all of it together beautifully. In this scene, as everyone plays together, Taki stops the band because of the saxophones. If you pay attention, the mistakes he hears are ones you can pick up on yourself. He then asks the saxes to play alone, one by one, which is something that band directors do all the time. And when Aoi plays, it just sounds like someone playing a tenor saxophone. To most people, it wouldn't sound amazing, but it would be fine. However, to anyone who has experienced the situation firsthand, this sounds like someone who is incredibly unsure of themselves. The way this scene plays out and how it sounds are remarkable to me because of how true to life it feels. And though I only point out this scene, that's true for most of the things that happen in the show. The specificity and detail to the world the show is trying to recreate are so good that, to be honest, it's a bit uncanny. And that's why I feel the way I do about the show. If you haven't guessed by now, I used to be in concert band in high school, and how I view this show is colored entirely by that experience. As someone who was part of a competitive ensemble, I can say pretty comfortably that, at least for me, this is one of the most realistic pieces of media I have ever seen. And it's moments like the one with Aoi that make this show so difficult to watch. I've been on the receiving end of a situation like that, and as uncomfortable as it is to watch, it's a lot more uncomfortable to live through. And because the world of the show is so thoroughly built out and so well realized, it's very easy for me to put myself in Aoi's shoes and completely empathize with the thoughts that she has that are never said out loud. I know the humiliation that comes with this moment. I walked away from my computer to take a breather because of how anxious I got watching this scene. But if the world building was not as specific as it is, I'm not sure I would have reacted as viscerally as I did. did. The tightrope the story and show have to walk is impressive, and it requires the people who work on it know exactly what they're doing. That extends to the way the show looks too, and I just want to briefly mention it. The conducting is in line with the music. The instrument fingerings you see are actually what they would be. And one of the smallest details I saw was the fact that they took the time to include the clothespins people use when they practice outside to make sure their music doesn't blow away in the wind. Many of the details the show and story include aren't necessary. If you took them out, the story wouldn't change, but they do provide the tactility that's integral for this genre. And so that's the reason why I feel the way I do. Watching this show is like opening a time capsule. While nothing that happens in the show happened to me, I very much could imagine this story playing out in my own life back then. It's one thing to relate to characters and their struggles, but it's another thing altogether to relate so deeply to the world they inhabit. The show recreates an atmosphere that I thought I forgot, and with it brings back memories that are so specific to that time and place in my life. The joy of being able to perform in front of a crowd, the stress of standing in the wings, the anxiety of waiting for the results of a competition, the heartbreak of losing. Sometimes it can be overwhelming connecting with something so deeply when it's so specific to you, which is why I find this show so difficult to watch. That was originally where I was going to end this, but after rewatching the show, I realized that my views on it have changed slightly. Overall, I still feel the same way, but I'm a firm believer in the idea that the personal context you bring into a piece of media, how and why you connect with the things you do, is just as important as any of the inherent qualities of a given work. It's the reason why I talk about the things I do. And as I've grown older and as my context changes, my relationship to this show has as well. One of the things that happens when you create a well-thought-out world is that you begin to understand things about the characters that you otherwise wouldn't have. You can see things from a perspective that might challenge the way you think from day to day. Like many of the characters in the show, I had no desire to continue with band once high school was over. When I started college, I left that world behind, which I don't regret and still don't. But thinking back to that time in my life all these years later, sometimes I find myself asking, why did I even bother at all? Why did I spend so much time dedicating myself to something that in the end would never matter? I could try to justify it with the idea that what was important were the friends or the memories I made along the way, but I could have made all of those things doing something else that would be relevant to me now. This is a struggle and question that Kumiko and many other characters face throughout the show, albeit without the hindsight that I have. And the answer they find is one that requires the context of the world that surrounds them. Because on its face, it doesn't make any sense. There are no practical benefits that you gain from this experience, nothing that you couldn't get by doing something else. To anyone who looks at this situation from the outside, the most logical thing to do would be to find an activity that's more productive and worthwhile. It's what I find myself thinking when I look back on that time. But the show pushes back on that line of thinking, and it made me realize the thing I forgot. I was in band because I liked it, and that was the only reason I ever needed. Back then, we didn't know what would happen in the future or even what we wanted to do. And in that uncertainty, a lot of us dedicated ourselves to something that we knew would eventually come to an end. For most of the characters in the show, the things they achieve won't matter to them in the future, and they are fully aware of that fact. Characters like Aoi make that obvious to everyone, but there was no real logic or reason to what we were doing. We knew that what we had wouldn't matter and would never last. But despite all of that, most of us stayed anyways. For these characters, the value of being in band doesn't come from the benefits they'll reap later in life. It comes from the simple joy of doing something they love. That mindset is something that I think the show captures perfectly. It isn't something that's explained or justified, because it can't be. You understand these characters and their mindset because you see the world they live in. Not being able to remember the importance of something that I used to cherish, not being able to see the value in doing something that brings you happiness, that, for me in this point in my life, that hits harder than anything else. Right now, I'm writing and editing this video between shifts of a job I don't particularly like, that I originally took as something temporary, but eventually stayed at because I thought it could be a stepping stone. And I needed the money, to be perfectly honest, which is still true, probably now more than ever, so I'm grateful to have been able to take this job at all. But in doing so, I started treating the things I do like a transaction, taking on projects and tasks that I thought might benefit me later at the cost of things I wanted to do. Of course, that's the most responsible thing to do, and I'm not gonna pretend that it isn't. But as this year has gone on, things have only gotten more uncertain. And that line of thinking begins to fall apart when you start to realize just how unstable things really are, and question whether or not those sacrifices are worth anything at all. 2020 has been a strange year for so many different reasons. My life has changed drastically, sometimes for the better and sometimes not so much. I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this show, because it certainly wasn't because I thought people were interested in this topic, not that it really matters to me. I could get some amount of comfort talking about a show that makes me remember a different time and place in my life, how it captures the atmosphere of that world, the tiny details that make it impressive, and reminisce. Remembering all the band camps, performances, practices I was a part of, the spirit of which the show captures really well. What I didn't expect when revisiting the show was how relevant it would be to me now. These characters have to confront the fact that for most of them, nothing that they do will matter, but they understand that there is value in doing something they love. People like Mamiko deal with the consequences of abandoning that pursuit. It wasn't her choice, but the pressure to sacrifice for the sake of an uncertain future is there. And she realizes that the future she was working towards wasn't what she wanted or was never there at all. The regret she feels for leaving behind all the things she loved is heartbreaking. I've sacrificed a lot of things to get to where I am now, most of which I don't regret. But when I'm writing emails at work that don't matter or take phone calls with people I don't like, and I'm mostly talking about you, Jason, you're the goddamn worst. Watching this show now makes me confront something that I didn't want to think about. Take away all the things I've told myself to justify the things I've sacrificed, and what I'm left with is doing something I don't like for a future that isn't guaranteed. This is the new context through which I view the show. Sound Euphonium is a story about life in a high school concert band. It follows characters who do what they love even though it won't last. It's a slice of life that shares a striking resemblance to a particular time in mine, and captures the atmosphere of a time and place that I left behind so accurately, at least to my experience, that it can be hard to watch. Reflections can be difficult to look at. Sometimes you remember things you'd rather forget, but sometimes they can show you the things you've lost. And this story does that for me now too. I grew up and grew older from the time in my life that this story recreates. And along the way, I lost the mindset of being able to dedicate myself to something just because I want to. And realizing that, at least for me, makes this show unwatchable. This isn't a review, so take it for what you will. I don't expect people to react the same way as me. These are just my thoughts and feelings on a show I love. But I am grateful if you've watched until the very end. I just want to say thank you to everyone who stopped by this little corner of YouTube for inspiring me to try and do something I actually kind of enjoy, at least for a little while. Thank you 12,000 times over.